Welcome to Series 2, Chapter 2 of Dr. Not Guilty, adapted directly from the comprehensive book written by Dr. Rifai. In this episode, titled Hippocratic Oath Criminal Statute, we engage in an exhaustive, deeply analytical, full 30-minute broadcast examining how an ancient, sacred, ethical vow has gradually transformed into a dangerous, modern legal trap. Over the course of our detailed discussion today, we will explore how the noble calling of medicine, historically dedicated entirely to relieving human suffering, preserving human life, and guarding personal dignity, became tangled in an intricate web of aggressive administrative regulations, sweeping federal criminal statutes and unprecedented prosecutorial overreach within the modern American justice system. To fully comprehend this profound systemic transformation and how legal mechanics now intersect with everyday clinical practice, we must first examine where my own personal and professional journey began many decades ago. I grew up during one of the most turbulent, violent, and deeply traumatic periods in modern Syrian history. While many international observers around the world are familiar with the devastating Syrian civil war that erupted in 2011, far fewer remember the earlier brutal internal conflict that raged continuously between 1978 and 1983, deeply scarring my childhood, my community, and my family life. During those intense years, the historic city of Hama was reduced to rubble, and an omnipresent atmosphere of terror settled over daily existence as an armed insurgency fought against the military regime of President Hafez al-Assad. Living through that violent era taught me at a very early age what it feels like when state authority becomes completely arbitrary, when fundamental human rights are suspended without warning, and when ordinary citizens find themselves caught helplessly in the crossfire of political power dynamics far beyond their control. In those challenging years, innocent civilians like my family were trapped directly between two uncompromising, relentless forces. In 1981, when I was only a third-grade student, I witnessed sheer terror firsthand on a regular school day. While riding on my school bus home, our vehicle came to a sudden halt directly behind another bus carrying high school students. Heavily armed government soldiers unexpectedly ordered those young students off their bus and forced them to line up against a concrete wall before opening fire in broad daylight. Barely a month later, violent gun battles erupted directly around our own school bus, and stray bullets tore through the metal body of our vehicle, missing my head by mere inches. The terrifying sound of shattering glass, screaming metal, and my pounding heart marked the exact moment my emotional core was forever formed. Those early childhood experiences implanted within me an enduring sensitivity to legal injustice, a deep empathy for human suffering, and a profound, lifelong reverence for the sacred value of every single human life. Trauma ran exceptionally deep throughout our extended family history as well. On my father's side lay severe, unaddressed struggles with substance addiction and emotional hardship, while on my mother's side, severe clinical depression cast a long, persistent shadow over multiple generations. Practicing our Islamic faith as devout believers required quiet, secret devotion during those years, because even visiting a local mosque brought immediate risk of deadly political suspicion, and longtime neighbors could vanish overnight into state prisons without any legal process or explanation. In a socio-political environment where asking basic questions or showing personal vulnerability could easily result in immediate arrest, secret torture, or death, our family learned to rely upon quiet personal faith, deep internal resilience, and an unwavering moral compass that no tyrannical governmental system could ever strip away. That profound sense of vulnerability deeply shaped my understanding of clinical practice, making me view every suffering patient as a unique soul in need of safety, empathy, and absolute protection from institutional oppression. Yet Aleppo, one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban centers in human history, has always demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to rise from physical and political ruin. Over time, as I grew into young adulthood, my personal childhood trauma transformed into a focused, lifelong professional purpose. I made the conscious decision to become a physician, internist, and psychiatrist, not to escape the painful memories of the past, but to actively stand with vulnerable human beings who were carrying invisible psychological wounds and offer them something far better than fear. Psychiatry ultimately became my professional refuge and my lifelong moral crusade, a medical discipline where rigorous scientific inquiry and unconditional human compassion meet to understand, treat, and heal the most hidden, misunderstood, and stigmatized aspects of the human experience. Through the comprehensive study of internal medicine, psychiatry, and addiction medicine, I sought to build a clinical framework that treats the complete human person with dignity, reverence, and unconditional respect. My ancient hometown of Aleppo had been continuously inhabited since at least the 6th millennium before Common Era, and remarkably, it was the historic home of one of the world's earliest dedicated psychiatric institutions, Bimaristan Argan, which continuously treated mental health patients from the mid-1400s all the way into the early 1900s. Long before modern Western medicine recognized formal psychiatric care, Aleppo treated the mentally ill not with iron chains or societal ostracization, but with specialized architecture, soothing music, flowing water, and compassionate medical care. Amidst centuries of war and political destruction, Aleppo historically preserved the dignity of the wounded mind, a rich, compassionate legacy that I have striven to bring into my clinical practice and share with the broader global medical community today. This profound historical heritage demonstrates conclusively that the solemn commitment to mental health, addiction treatment, and basic human dignity is not a modern policy innovation, but an ancient imperative deeply embedded in our collective human story. It reminds us that humanity's greatest achievement is not found in military dominance or political authority, but in our willingness to protect and care for the most vulnerable among us. This compassionate ethos directly reflects the sacred origins of medicine as a human practice across ancient civilizations. Long before modern healthcare systems were codified into thousands of pages of administrative regulations, insurance codes, and federal statutes, medicine was universally understood as a noble spiritual vocation grounded in selfless service, clinical humility, and profound reverence for human life. The physician served as a trusted mediator between human suffering and therapeutic healing, guided entirely by the solemn invocation of ethical oaths. Early clinical healers understood that physical health could never be detached from moral responsibility, and that the therapeutic covenant between doctor and patient was built upon absolute personal trust, moral integrity, personal sacrifice, and ultimate spiritual accountability before God and community. In ancient healing sanctuaries across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Asia, the practice of medicine was seen as a holy stewardship where taking a fee was secondary to preserving life and comforting the dying. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates of Kos lived and practiced during classical Greece in the 5th century before Common Era. In an era when human illness was almost universally attributed to divine wrath, demonic possession, or bad fortune, Hippocrates introduced the revolutionary scientific idea that physical and mental diseases must be understood through objective clinical observation, careful reasoning, and natural physical causes. Simultaneously, he sought to elevate the moral character, professional discipline, and sacred duty of the medical practitioner. By decoupling medicine from mystical superstition while dramatically raising its ethical standards, Hippocrates laid the permanent foundation for modern medical practice rooted in rigorous empirical observation and unwavering empathetic dedication to patient welfare. He insisted that true medical care required meticulous recording of symptoms, deep respect for the patient environment, and an unshakable ethical commitment that put the patient well-being above all financial or social considerations. The classical Hippocratic Oath established enduring universal standards of medical humility, professional discretion, strict self-discipline, and deep empathy. It explicitly demanded that practicing physicians abstain from all intentional harm, honor, and respect their clinical mentors, maintain absolute patient confidentiality, and strictly refuse to administer lethal poisons or participate in corrupt financial practices, thereby defining medical practice as a binding spiritual contract. For over 2,000 years, this sacred pledge served as an unwritten moral constitution for healers across civilizations, ensuring that regardless of changing political regimes, economic systems, or societal pressures, the personal health and dignity of the sick individual remain the single highest priority. The oath explicitly required doctors to enter a home only for the benefit of the sick, remaining free from all intentional injustice and corruption, and keeping secret whatever they saw or heard in the lives of their patients that ought not to be spoken abroad. The ancient Hippocratic text began with a solemn invocation to Apollo the healer and all the deities, pledging that the physician would carry out their duty with purity, honor, and devotion. It concluded with the aspirational hope that those who kept the oath faithfully would enjoy a life of professional respect and eternal good reputation among all people. Yet today, in stark contrast to its original historical purpose, this ancient pledge, meant as a protective ethical shield for vulnerable patients and an inspirational compass for healers, is increasingly being weaponized as a legal sword by government prosecutors. In courtrooms across the United States, prosecutors routinely manipulate clinical ethical standards and administrative guidelines to construct damning criminal narrative traps against dedicated physicians who dare to treat complex, high-risk, or highly regulated patient populations. Standard medical judgment and subjective clinical decision-making are systematically twisted into criminal intent by law enforcement agents who examine patient records through the punitive lens of federal criminal statutes. Across diverse global faith traditions, the art of healing has always been intrinsically interwoven with spiritual values. In Islamic theological tradition, seeking medical remedies is considered a form of religious worship grounded in profound trust in God, famously reflected in the prophetic teaching that for every disease that exists, God has created a corresponding cure. Similarly, in Jewish and Christian traditions, medical care is viewed as an extension of divine mercy, with the practicing physician serving as a humble, earthly instrument of God-healing grace. Eastern spiritual traditions likewise place holistic balance, compassionate care, and spiritual harmony at the very center of clinical practice. In every historic civilization, the doctor was held in esteem not as a commercial vendor selling a marketable commodity, but as a moral trustee entrusted with human life. This sacred obligation meant that physicians frequently risked their own physical safety during deadly plagues and social crises to fulfill their ethical mandate to care for the suffering. This universal moral framework placed medical ethics on a high, ultimate scale. Physicians strove to act honorably and truthfully, not out of fear of state regulatory inspections, law enforcement raids, or license revocations, but because they believed their professional choices carried weight before God and posterity. Uncompromising honesty, personal discretion, and absolute patient confidentiality were sacred mandates that conferred true social dignity upon the medical profession. When a suffering patient stepped into a doctor consultation room, they possessed complete confidence that their private secrets, personal shame, and medical vulnerabilities were fully protected from state intrusion, public exposure, or legal scrutiny. This total trust created an environment where patients could disclose their deepest fears, secret substance struggles, and private physical ailments without worrying that their doctor would be forced to act as an agent of state law enforcement. This ancient spiritual covenant placed an immense, solemn responsibility on healthcare providers to guard the sacred integrity of medical care. Patients trusted their doctors not merely as technicians with specialized physical knowledge, but as ethical human beings committed to a higher moral standard. This bedrock of deep therapeutic trust allowed physicians to boldly venture into the most challenging, delicate clinical situations, such as managing severe chronic pain, treating aggressive substance use disorders, and guiding patients through terminal illness, knowing that society understood and supported their benevolent clinical intentions. Without this fundamental safety net of societal trust, the practice of medicine loses its core humanity and degenerates into a defensive administrative exercise designed primarily to avoid regulatory liability rather than cure disease. In the modern era, however, this essential therapeutic bond has been severely damaged by the pervasive secularization, commercialization, and corporate industrialization of global healthcare systems. Mechanical administrative checklists, complex billing codes, algorithmic electronic health record systems, and draconian compliance protocols have systematically displaced the spiritual covenant between healer and patient. While medical science and pharmaceutical technology have achieved remarkable victories, the foundational soul of the profession has been heavily compromised as corporate profit margins, insurance company reimbursements, and defensive legal risk management have taken precedence over authentic clinical wisdom, diagnostic time, and individualized patient care. Doctors today are routinely forced to spend far more time clicking boxes on computer screens than looking into the eyes of suffering human beings, transforming human healers into glorified data entry clerks. In this highly commercialized and hyper-regulated modern environment, the classic spirit of the Hippocratic Oath is far too often distorted into a major legal liability. Conscientious physicians who act in complete good faith according to traditional medical ethics now find themselves in direct conflict with rigid, rapidly shifting government regulations and insurer guidelines. In this modern landscape, customized clinical care for a suffering human being can easily be recharacterized by federal law enforcement agents with zero medical training as an intentional criminal departure from standardized practice parameters or an illegal act of healthcare fraud. When a doctor chooses to give a desperate, uninsured patient extra clinical attention or attempts to customize a treatment plan outside rigid coverage rules, that act of medical compassion is frequently flagged by automated algorithms as suspicious fraud worthy of federal criminal investigation. We must ask ourselves hard, probing questions about what it truly means when dedicated, highly skilled physicians face complete financial ruin, personal public humiliation, and federal prison sentences simply for attempting to deliver compassionate clinical care to suffering human beings. What happens to a society when rigid legal formalism completely replaces nuanced medical judgment, and when the sacred calling to heal is captured by punitive state law enforcement mechanisms? This is not merely a theoretical debate for law school seminars or medical ethicists. It is an immediate crisis for thousands of American medical doctors who walk into their offices every single morning, facing the terrifying threat of federal subpoenas, surprise law enforcement raids, and professional destruction. When the threat of criminal prosecution looms, over every prescription pad, the true victim is ultimately the patient who is denied courageous, compassionate, and life-saving medical interventions. Consider the deeply unsettling real-world case of Dr. Stuart Gitlow. On the early morning of March 17, 2018, at 6:15 in the morning, heavily armed federal agents from the FBI launched a surprise raid on his private medical office and residence in Rhode Island, seizing thousands of confidential clinical charts, personal computers, and business financial records. Dr. Gitlow was far from a suspicious operator. He was an internationally respected authority in addiction medicine, a former president of the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, and a distinguished leader in medical ethics within the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Yet despite this traumatizing military-style raid and the public destruction of his reputation, years have elapsed with zero formal criminal charges filed and no medical wrongdoing substantiated, leaving his lifetime career in total legal limbo. The psychological and financial toll of such state action is catastrophic, effectively destroying a physician practice without ever affording them their day in court. Dr. Gitlow's experience illustrates an alarming pattern across the United States, where reputable physicians are targeted by aggressive federal task forces employing tactical enforcement measures previously reserved for organized crime syndicates. Federal investigators, law enforcement officers, and prosecutors without a single day of formal medical education or clinical practice routinely second-guess complex clinical decisions made by physicians in high-pressure, real-time clinical settings. By aggressively prosecuting medical decisions under the pretense of fighting healthcare fraud, government agencies ruin exemplary medical careers, effectively transforming the protective shield of the Hippocratic Oath into a deadly legal trap for conscientious doctors. These enforcement actions rely on retrospective analysis by paid government expert witnesses who apply rigid, idealized medical standards that ignore the messy, complex reality of actual clinical practice. Delivering a powerful, solemn address to the American Medical Association House of Delegates in 2023, Dr. Gitlow issued an urgent warning to the entire medical profession. He demonstrated in precise detail how physicians who cause zero physical harm and act strictly in what they believe to be the best clinical interest of their patients can face decades in federal penitentiaries simply for prescribing medications off-label or failing to strictly fulfill complex, shifting administrative documentation rules. Modern American healthcare has systematically replaced foundational medical ethics with a cold, punitive regulatory apparatus that views every single practicing doctor with deep suspicion and treats them as a potential federal criminal. He emphasized that under current judicial interpretations, the government can convict a doctor without ever proving that any patient was physically harmed or that the doctor intended to violate the law, creating an unacceptable atmosphere of terror across clinical medicine. In this high-pressure legal environment, practicing physicians are forced to spend immense amounts of time and energy navigating intrusive state surveillance alongside their demanding patient schedules. When administrative compliance, prior authorization demands, and constant fear of criminal indictment override clinical instinct and medical judgment, the sacred bond of trust between doctor and patient completely breaks down into pervasive mutual anxiety. Doctors are driven into practicing extreme defensive medicine, frequently refusing to accept high-risk patients, declining to prescribe necessary controlled medications, and abandoning entire vulnerable communities, which fundamentally destroys the compassionate heart of the medical profession. Patients suffering from severe chronic pain, psychiatric crises, or complex addictions find themselves turned away by doctors who simply cannot afford the immense legal risk of treating them. This dramatic, troubling escalation in criminal investigations targeting healthcare providers over the past 3 decades marks a profound structural shift toward the criminalization of routine medical judgment. At the absolute center of this regulatory transformation are federal criminal statutes enacted under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, commonly referred to as SHIP-AA, codified in federal law under Title 18 of the United States Code, specifically Sections 1347 and 1349. These expansive federal statutes grant government prosecutors extraordinary, unprecedented power to investigate and charge doctors with federal health care fraud without needing to prove traditional, specific, fraudulent criminal intent. What was originally promoted to the public as a modest patient privacy law was quietly converted into an unprecedented criminal enforcement engine against the medical profession. Under this incredibly broad statutory structure, dedicated medical professionals can face federal indictment and decades in prison for making legitimate, individualized clinical treatment decisions that happen to differ from federal billing guidelines or standard insurance company rules. Minor documentation delays, clerical coding discrepancies, or routine administrative mistakes can be easily reframed by ambitious federal prosecutors as deliberate criminal schemes to defraud federal healthcare programs, exposing physicians to severe, multi-count felony conspiracy indictments carrying life-altering prison terms. Because healthcare billing involves thousands of hyper-technical regulations that change constantly, no medical practice can maintain perfect administrative record keeping, leaving every single practicing physician perpetually vulnerable to arbitrary prosecution whenever federal authorities decide to target them. With the fundamental constitutional presumption of innocence virtually stripped away in modern healthcare prosecutions, physicians now work under the permanent cloud of catastrophic legal disaster. The overwhelming institutional pressure to strictly comply with hyper-technical billing standards and arbitrary administrative mandates completely stifles clinical innovation and diagnostic courage. Good faith medical decisions made for the benefit of suffering human beings are routinely parsed and analyzed out of context by federal prosecutors before lay juries who possess zero medical training and are easily misled by complex technical presentations. When a trial comes down to a battle of medical experts, lay jurors often default to the authority of federal law enforcement officers, assuming that the government would never bring criminal charges unless the doctor was guilty of deliberate wrongdoing. A deeply disturbing case study that illustrates this tragic reality is that of Dr. Antonio Reyes Vizcarrondo in Puerto Rico. Dr. Vizcarrondo found himself wrongfully indicted on multiple federal healthcare fraud counts after an independent hospital administrative entity and third-party medical staffing company unlawfully double-billed insurance plans for his professional services entirely without his knowledge, authorization, or consent. Although years of exhausting, financially ruinous legal proceedings eventually vindicated him and demonstrated that the billing anomalies were committed entirely by the administrative agency, the enormous financial cost, public humiliation, and extreme psychological stress permanently destroyed his clinical practice and shattered his family life. His case proves that in the modern regulatory environment, complete factual innocence is no guarantee against total professional and personal ruin. This heartbreaking case underscores the relentless, systemic nature of contemporary medical prosecutions. Statutory amendments enacted by Congress in 2010 further amended the federal healthcare fraud statute to explicitly eliminate the requirement that the government prove a defendant had actual knowledge of the criminal statute or specific intent to violate federal law. This sweeping statutory modification exposed every practicing physician in America to severe federal felony charges, even if they had absolutely no knowledge of clerical billing errors or administrative compliance issues committed by third-party billing agents, or corporate health administrators. By lowering the legal standard of criminal intent, Congress created a legal regime where ordinary administrative negligence can be punished with the same severity as international financial fraud or violent criminal conspiracies. As a direct result of these aggressive laws, simple miscommunications with billing departments, software technical errors, or compassionate off-label prescribing practices are routinely treated by federal law enforcement as major felony crimes with potential prison sentences equal to or greater than those for violent crimes. Facing mandatory minimum sentences, immediate freezing of bank accounts, asset forfeiture, and absolute financial destruction, many completely innocent, highly dedicated physicians are effectively coerced into signing guilty plea agreements, surrendering their medical licenses, and accepting criminal convictions for offenses they never committed simply to preserve their freedom and avoid dying in a federal prison cell. The criminal justice system leverages these massive exposure risks to force plea bargains, ensuring high conviction rates for government task forces while burying the truth of physician innocence. When our society stops viewing medical professionals as ethical healers striving to relieve human suffering and instead treats them as potential targets for criminal investigation, the entire healthcare system suffers catastrophic damage. Physician burnout and suicide rates have surged to historic levels. Talented young medical trainees are fleeing high-risk specialties like addiction medicine, chronic pain management, and primary care, and independent community medical practices are rapidly collapsing under regulatory burdens. This aggressive criminalization of clinical care is not only deeply unjust to dedicated public servants, it is dangerous to public health and entirely unsustainable for our nation. Entire rural and low-income communities are left completely devoid of medical specialists because doctors cannot assume the terrifying legal liability of practicing in underserved regions. To repair this broken system, we must return with determination to the true core of the ancient oath, reclaiming its timeless commitment to moral duty, patient protection, and selfless service. We stand today at a vital crossroad in the history of medicine. We must collectively decide whether 21st century healthcare will remain dominated by fear, administrative coercion, and legal prosecution, or whether we will courageously rebuild a medical system anchored in ethical integrity, clinical autonomy, and genuine trust between doctors and their patients. Reclaiming medicine requires us to actively push back against the overreach of administrative agencies and insist that medical care be evaluated by qualified clinical peers rather than law enforcement officers and government attorneys. Practicing physicians must be granted the moral and legal freedom to care for sick and suffering human beings with wisdom, empathy, and diagnostic freedom, completely unburdened by the constant shadow of potential imprisonment. As Dr. Gitlow rightfully emphasized, the medical community, legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and federal legislators must unite to champion comprehensive statutory reform. We must decriminalize standard medical care, establish clear legal protections for good faith clinical judgment, and safeguard the doctor-patient relationship as a sacred space free from unreasonable government intrusion. Statutory reforms must explicitly require the government to prove heightened, specific criminal intent and demonstrable bad faith before any practicing physician can be subjected to criminal indictment or asset forfeiture. In the final analysis, medicine is and must always remain a noble, divine vocation. Those who dedicate their lives to practicing the healing arts with honor, integrity, and clinical excellence deserve our societal gratitude and robust legal protection, not unfair criminal prosecution. Let us stand together to restore the practice of medicine to its rightful place as a high calling of human conscience, clinical expertise, and unwavering compassion. Thank you for listening to this comprehensive 30-minute broadcast of Dr. Not Guilty. Stay tuned for future episodes as we continue to stand up for the sacred integrity of medicine and the defense of innocent physicians.